You are sitting in the back of a Ford Country Squire station wagon. It is 1973. You are 7 years old, and you are facing the wrong way. The rear-facing third-row seat puts your back to the direction of travel, your knees almost touching the tailgate glass, and through that glass you can see the car behind you close enough to read the numbers on its license plate. There is no seatbelt across your lap. There is one bolted to the floor somewhere beneath the seat, but nobody has mentioned it, and it may be stuffed so far into the crack of the vinyl cushion that you have never seen it. The car smells like the vinyl itself, heated by the sun through the rear window, mixed with the faint sweetness of your mother's tab cola in the front seat, and the specific, unmistakable smell of a station wagon carpet that has absorbed years of spilled milk, wet dog, and melted crayons. You are watching the road unspool behind you at 65 miles per hour, inches from the glass, and no one in the car thinks anything is unusual about this arrangement. If you survived childhood in America between 1955 and 1985, you did things that would get your parents arrested today, or at least investigated. Not because your parents were reckless, because the entire country operated on a set of assumptions about risk, authority, and personal freedom that have since been dismantled, law by law, death by death, one federal regulation at a time. Each of those assumptions has a specific endpoint, a specific year, a specific law or ruling or body count that broke the old consensus. This is the record of what was normal, when it stopped being normal, and why. Start with where children sat in cars, because that is the memory that lives in the body. The station wagon rear-facing seat was a standard feature of American family vehicles, from the late 1950s through the early 1980s. Ford built it into the Country Squire. Chevrolet put it in the Caprice estate wagon. Buick offered it in the estate wagon. In early 70s configurations, there were no lap belts in that third row at all. By mid-decade, belts were installed, but use rates across the entire country, all seating positions, all ages, were below 15%. That is not an estimate. That is NHTSA data. 85% of Americans rode in cars without fastening anything. The first state to require you to buckle up was New York, and that law did not take effect until December 1st, 1984. So you sat backward, unbelted, watching the highway recede. And if the family had a pickup truck instead of a wagon, you sat in the open bed, whined in your hair at highway speed on public roads. This was not a rural eccentricity. It was standard practice across suburban and rural America, common enough to appear in advertising without irony. And here is the part that surprises people. There is no single federal law that ever banned it. As of 2019, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety counted only 30 states with laws specifically prohibiting passengers in pickup truck beds, and most of those contained exceptions for agricultural work, parades, and rural roads. In some states, it is still technically legal to put your children in the back of a truck on a public highway. The practice didn't end because of one decisive law. It ended because the culture shifted, state by state, decade by decade, as the data accumulated. And the data was not ambiguous. NHTSA research documented that unrestrained occupants in open cargo areas faced ejection risk approaching 100% at collision speeds above 25 miles per hour. No structure, no restraint, just air and asphalt. In 1972, motor vehicle crashes killed approximately 54,500 people in the United States. That is the highest single-year total in recorded American automotive history. Triple the modern figure, despite far fewer vehicle miles traveled. Children under 12 died at disproportionate rates per mile traveled. Tennessee became the first state to pass a mandatory child passenger safety law in 1978, covering children under 4. By 1985, all 50 states had some form of child restraint legislation. A pediatrician named Dr. Seymour Charles, who founded the American Academy of Pediatrics Auto Safety Program in 1971, provided the institutional pressure that translated crash statistics into the political will Tennessee finally acted on. 7 years from advocacy to first law. 7 more years before every state followed. That is how change worked in this era. Slowly. After the bodies were counted. Now, step inside a different kind of room. It is 1971, and you are sitting on a paper-covered examination table in your pediatrician's office. The room has cream-painted walls, a pendant fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and a pharmaceutical company calendar hanging next to the eye chart. Your doctor walks in wearing a white coat with a stethoscope around his neck. He picks up your chart, asks your mother about your cough, and lights a cigarette. There is an ashtray on his metal desk. He smokes while he examines you. This was not aberrant behavior. The medical profession's own smoking rate in 1975 was approximately 21%, compared to the general population rate of 37%. A meaningful gap, but 1 in 5 doctors still smoked, and the institutions that housed them were even slower to change. Hospitals maintained smoking lounges for staff through the 1970s. Some nursing stations had ashtrays. Hospital furniture manufacturers, including Hill-Rom, produced bed-frame designs with built-in ashtrays for patient use through at least the late 1960s. You could lie in a hospital bed recovering from surgery and smoke. Here is the timeline that makes this staggering. The Surgeon General's report establishing the federal scientific consensus that cigarettes caused lung cancer was published in 1964. The American hospital did not officially go smoke-free until the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations issued its mandate in 1992, requiring all accredited hospitals to be entirely smoke-free by December 31st, 1993. 29 years. The science was settled in 1964. The hospitals caught up in 1993. And while doctors smoked in examining rooms, cigarette companies advertised on television. Camel, Chesterfield, Pall Mall, every brand you can picture, running commercials between your favorite shows. The Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act, signed April 1st, 1970, banned cigarette advertising on television and radio effective January 2nd, 1971. Not January 1st, January 2nd. The date was specifically chosen to allow tobacco companies one last set of New Year's Day bowl game advertisements. The final cigarette commercial broadcast on American television was a Virginia Slims ad that aired during The Tonight Show on the night of January 1st, 1971. The last permissible moment. Someone in a boardroom calculated the value of that last bowl game ad cycle and wrote the accommodation into the legislation. If you remember cigarette commercials on TV, you are in a specific demographic window. If you don't, they vanished before you were old enough to notice. Either way, they existed, on every channel, every evening, selling a product that the Surgeon General had already declared lethal for 6 years after the official finding. Now think about school. Specifically, think about the principal's office. In many schools across the South and Midwest through the 1970s, a wooden paddle hung on the wall behind the principal's desk. It was typically a piece of 3/4-inch plywood, about 18 inches long with a handle. Sometimes holes were drilled through the face to reduce air resistance and increase the sting. It was not decorative. It was used. Teachers and administrators struck students with these paddles as standard disciplinary practice, and in many districts, the default assumption was that the school had the authority to do it. Parents who objected had to submit written notification to opt their child out. The institution assumed the right to hit. The family had to formally claim exemption. In 1977, the Supreme Court heard the case of Ingram versus Wright. A student in a Florida school had been paddled so severely he required medical attention. The court ruled 5-4 that school corporal punishment did not violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Justice Lewis Powell, writing for the majority, argued that the openness of the public school and its supervision by the community provided sufficient safeguards against abuse. Justice Byron White, dissenting, wrote that the majority's holding abandoned children to a constitutional void in an area where the need for protection was apparent. That ruling has never been overturned. It is active precedent today. And 19 states still legally permit corporal punishment in public schools under its authority. The reflexive belief that we moved past that is geographically incomplete. It is worth pausing here because the pattern is becoming visible. The country did not simply wake up one morning and decide these practices were unacceptable. In every case, there was a period, sometimes decades, where the evidence existed, the harm was documented, and the practice continued because the consensus to change had not yet formed. The science on tobacco was settled in 1964. The hospitals went smoke-free in 1993. The Supreme Court declined to protect children from paddling in 1977. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 in 1971, and 29 states promptly lowered their drinking ages to match. The logic was straightforward. If you could vote and be drafted, you could buy a beer. That patchwork of state drinking ages is one of the more remarkable regulatory landscapes in American history. Before the National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984, there was no federal minimum. States set their own. Louisiana allowed beer and wine purchase at 18 for extended periods. Wisconsin set 18 for beer and wine, but 21 for spirits. New York permitted beer and wine at 18 through 1982. A handful of states, including California, maintained 21 throughout. The result was what advocates called blood borders, teenagers in states with higher drinking ages driving to adjacent states with lower ones, drinking and driving back. The traffic fatality data from those border zones was specific and damning. Candy Lightner founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving in 1980 after her 13-year-old daughter, Kari, was killed by a repeat drunk driver in Fair Oaks, California. Lightner testified before Congress in 1982, describing a pre-reform landscape in which drunk driving was socially acceptable and routinely unprosecuted. Her advocacy, combined with the traffic data, built the political pressure that produced the 1984 Act. And here is the detail that earns a double take. The president who signed that act into law had spent his entire career opposing exactly this kind of federal mandate on states. The mechanism that resolved the ideological tension was financial rather than legal. The act threatened to withhold 10% of federal highway funding from any state that did not raise its minimum drinking age to 21. It was not technically a mandate. It was a financial lever so powerful that by 1988, every single state had complied. Everyone. Now walk into an airport. It is 1969. You have a ticket for a domestic flight. You walk from the terminal entrance to the gate without passing through any screening of any kind. No metal detector, no X-ray machine. No one examines your bag or asks you to remove your shoes. Your family walks with you to the gate. They stand at the window and wave as the plane pulls back. This was the universal American air travel experience before January 5, 1973. The reason it changed was not abstract policy. In 1969 alone, 40 American domestic flights were hijacked. Not in a decade, in 1 year. Most were what became darkly known as Cuba hijackings. Individuals who commandeered aircraft and demanded to be flown to Havana. The phenomenon was so common, it generated its own grim humor. "Take me to Cuba" became a punchline. It was not funny. On January 5, 1973, the FAA issued an emergency amendment mandating that all airline passengers and carry-on baggage be screened before boarding. Metal detector magnetometers, developed and tested through 1972, became the universal entry point. This was not the security apparatus you know today. Removing shoes, limiting liquids, full-body scanners, the Transportation Security Administration itself, all of that came after September 11, 2001. The TSA was created by the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, signed November 19, 2001. But the basic principle that someone checks before you board, that began on a specific date in January 1973 because 40 planes were hijacked in a single year. One more. This one is the one people don't believe until you show them the regulatory record. Before 1971, you could walk into a hardware store in rural America and buy dynamite, commercial-grade explosives, for stump removal, rock clearing, irrigation channel blasting, well drilling. DuPont marketed farm-use dynamite through agricultural dealers and catalogs. The Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware, which holds the DuPont Corporate Archive, contains agricultural explosives, marketing materials from the 1920s through the 1960s. This was a normal consumer product sold to farmers the way fertilizer was sold, because for farmers, it served a comparable practical function. There was no federal background check, no federal record-keeping mandate, no federal licensing requirement for the buyer. That changed with Title 11 of the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970, signed October 15, 1970, which created the first federal licensing and regulation framework for commercial explosives under ATF administration, effective in 1971. The further tightening came with the Safe Explosives Act of 2002, part of the Homeland Security Act, which added criminal background checks for all commercial explosives purchases. 3 eras: casual purchase at the farm store before 1971, federal dealer licensing after 1971, individual background checks after 2002. Now here is the fact that reframes all of this. Every one of these practices, the unbelted children, the smoking doctors, the unscreened airports, the paddled students, the 18-year-old beer buyers, was taking place against an environmental backdrop that nobody was measuring carefully enough. The EPA initiated the phase-out of leaded gasoline in 1973. The complete elimination of lead from road-use gasoline was not finalized until January 1, 1996. Every car that passed you on the street between roughly 1940 and 1996 was emitting lead into the air you breathed. The first National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, conducted between 1976 and 1980, measured the blood lead levels of American children aged 1 to 5. The mean was approximately 15 micrograms per deciliter. The CDC's current reference level for elevated blood lead in children, the level that triggers medical intervention, is 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, revised downward from 5 in 2021. The average American child in 1978 was carrying lead in their blood at more than 4 times the level we now treat as poisoning. That is not nostalgia. That is the specific, documented, physiological reality of growing up in the 1970s. None of this means the memories are false. The wind in your hair in the pickup truck bed was real. The freedom of walking your family to the airport gate was real. The way Saturday morning felt when you were 8 when the whole world seemed to operate at a pace you could follow. That was real, too. The warmth of the era is not a lie, but the warmth existed inside a system that was killing and harming people at rates we have since reduced through specific laws with specific dates, passed because specific people, Candy Lightner, Dr. Seymour Charles, William Ruckelshaus at the EPA, the CPSC staffers who tracked lawn dart injuries, fought for specific changes against specific resistance. The story of this video is not that things were worse then. It is not that things are better now. It is that every practice on this list was defended by reasonable people who said it was fine, until the evidence became impossible to ignore, and someone wrote a law. That is how a society learns. Not all at once, not gracefully, one practice at a time, one death toll at a time, one reluctant signature at a time. Your parents were not reckless. They were normal. Normal just meant something different when the laws hadn't caught up to the data, and the data was always there, waiting for someone to count it carefully enough to act. If you rode in the back of a pickup truck, or sat backward in a station wagon, or walked to an airport gate without a single person checking your bag, leave a comment with the specific detail you remember. Not the general feeling, the specific thing, the smell, the sound, the texture of the vinyl. That specificity is what separates memory from myth, and it is worth preserving exactly as it was. Subscribe if you want the era told straight. Not filtered through greeting cards, not debunked for sport. Just the record, specific and clear, handled with the care it earns.